We are here today to have a conversation. First of all, I'm John Horgan. I am a science writer and I teach at Stevens Institute of Technology. And I'm talking to one of my colleagues at Stevens, Professor Samantha Muka, who is an historian of science, technology, sort of in that ballpark, who has written a new book. And we're going to talk about the book today. Here it is. Let's see. I'm trying to get that to come into focus.
You have to put it right in front of your face because that's the thing that's supposed to be like in front of your actual face.
Oh, the thing is
there. There
right.
it is.
Yeah, because I've got the blur function on.
Yes.
Thank you.
There we go.
So anyway, you have written this really cool book, which I've been reading for the last 2 days. And it's called Oceans Under Glass, Tank Craft and the Science of the Sea. And I just wanted to enthuse about your book for a second before I start asking you questions. What I love about this book is that it sounds so much like you. So you're one of my favorite colleagues at Stevens. I mean, I love everybody, but you're one of my favorite colleagues because pretty much every single time I talk to you, you tell me something really interesting that I didn't know before. And you tell it to me with great enthusiasm, with excitement, and that's infectious. And, some scholars don't convey their own passion for their research in their writing. And fortunately, that's not a problem for you. So in this book about aquariums, you're telling us lots of really cool, interesting things, and people who are involved in this pretty old technology, and you're telling it all with this excitement and passion that really came through to me, and I'm sure it will come through to other readers. And that's why I think that this book could easily break out of the audience of other historians of technology and people who are interested in marine biology and those sorts of things, and get a broader readership of people who just care about technology in general, and care about the future of the oceans and all the creatures that inhabit the oceans, and people who just want a really cool story about lots of cool stories about science and technology. So well done, Sam.
Thanks. I am the most commonly used word on my student evaluations is enthusiastic, right? It's not always a compliment, but yeah.
From me, definitely. So the first thing I wanted to ask you, though, is how did you become what you are? Where did your passion for this particular set of issues, this kind of knowledge, come from? Because you didn't grow up in a coastal area, as I recall.
Well, I did and I didn't. So I grew up in the Boot Heel of Missouri, so next to the Mississippi River, which we consider coastal. It's a different type of coastline, but it does matter, and there's a reason that there's kind of this inland story there. And then I also grew up kind of equally in South Florida. I don't consider that necessarily. Some people will say, if you talk to a geologist, often they'll say, like, I'm from North Dakota or Montana or Idaho, right? They have like a very specific geographical conversation. And the people who I talk to who are aquarium enthusiasts, a lot of them, or marine biologists, grew up in Florida or grew up in California, right? So this is a thing that they do. But I think my interest is actually in the type of kind of knowledge that is needed to work these things. So one of the things that is important is I didn't grow up in a highly academic environment. In either one of those environments, I grew up in spaces where people were blue collar workers, where they are craftspeople. They do a lot of work with their hands, and they do a lot of work that they can't really explain right? And they do a lot of work on the land, which is equally important. So in Missouri, right, we have a lot of farmers, we have a lot of people who do work on the river. And those are the type of people who are kind of these kind of journeyman farmers, or these people that learn to know things in a very particular way. So the book is about the aquarium as being a piece of technology that is allowing you to understand something, and you don't have to be an academic scientist. You just get to kind of play around with it. You can be really good at it. You can not even have like a high school degree, right? And so I think I got interested in that type of work when I got into the history of science. I found myself not interested in scientists. I actually find it pretty boring to study people in laboratories in a very particular way. And so I entered as a historian of medicine because of the labor that I was interested in. And when I did my first research paper in graduate school, I ended up working on some field workers, and one of them happened to be the first secretary of the New York Aquarium. And when I went into those archives, I just realized that this was the group that I really wanted to work on. They're just really fun and exciting, and even today, you know, in conversation with people who keep aquariums, they're just really super knowledgeable in a way that is extremely humble, right? So someone will talk to you and they will literally be saying something that is so hard for them to do, and they'll be like, I don't know, I just did it, right? That's just a thing I did. And I find that just really refreshing, right? So,
That's great. Yeah, tinkerers. I wanted to get back
yeah.
to tinkering as a really fundamental part of the culture of aquariums. But first, you're an historian, so can you just give us a real quick history of aquariums? How far back does the basic idea of the aquarium go, as far as we know?
Well, so it depends. So if you're just talking about keeping animals in captivity to either keep them alive to eat them later or to watch them, it's very ancient, right? So people have been keeping and breeding goldfish, which came from Asian carp for centuries, right? Um, Things like that kind of entered the European consciousness in like the 16th century, but they're much older than that. And so when you hear people say like, oh, someone, you know, built the first aquarium, right? Like, does like an oyster enclosure count as an aquarium? I mean, maybe it does. The first modern aquarium is in the 1850s, and the reason it comes about is not because no one ever had this idea before, but because chemistry made it easier to make plate glass cheap. And so once plate glass became a really cheap commodity, the aquarium as we know it kind of came forward, and rubber also was required for rubber tubing and things like that. And so about 1850, we start to see people consistently developing aquaria, keeping them in the home, in the public aquarium space, so for viewership of the public, and then in laboratories. And those three groups arose at the exact same time. They're kind of intertwined because of the technology and the people who developed it. And then there isn't much difference today. So I wrote a whole book about how aquariums evolved over, you know, the last 150 years. And I can truthfully say, like, they're still not that different than they used to be. You still just need, you know, a glass box, running water, and food for whatever you want to put in there. And then you have yourself a pretty rudimentary system.
So one of the things that's so fascinating about I'm going to stick with aquariums because that's how I think of it. Instead,
They are both okay. They're just, it's for consistency, actually. So
okay,
don't ever let someone tell you that it's not right. Aquariums and Aquaria, both the same. Yeah.
Okay, good. So it seems to me that they perform a lot of different functions, and it depends on who's using them, what the function is. So it's science, trying to understand these organisms in a place where you can look at them closely. It's entertainment. And so you've got SeaWorld and you've got the aquariums that people have in their homes where they've got pretty fish floating around and we like to look at them. Conservation now. and trying to figure out how we can save some of these organisms that are endangered, and also food.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
fish farming. And so you've got all these different things going on with aquariums. And your book shows how all these communities are constantly interacting with each other and talking to each other to produce innovation and share ideas and that sort of thing. So I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit. What I don't know, what's the main driver of aquarium technology today, would you say?
Oh my goodness. It's like you've learned nothing. There isn't one. So
Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the most important things is that we not put aquarium users into categories, right? So a public aquarium does all of the things that you just mentioned, right? They're there to educate people. Some public aquariums, especially in Japan and other spaces, raise food. They're raising tuna to figure out how to keep them for long periods of time so that they can use them. You know, public aquariums in California are raising white abalone, which will eventually be fished later. The Tennessee Aquarium is raising sturgeon for the exact same reason. So these are the types of spaces that do everything. You can do the same thing in a home. So, you know, if you go to a Chinese restaurant or you go to a dentist's office, is there an appreciable difference in the way that their aquariums are working? Sometimes, right? But sometimes they just perform multiple functions, right? They are meant to be aesthetically pleasing and also useful. And you might think, well, that's not the same in a laboratory, right? Because laboratory aquariums don't have to be aesthetically pleasing because they're just there for the truth. But if you ask any scientist, they would say that there is something very important about beauty, which is that it often represents a system which is working correctly, right? If you have an aquarium that is not viewable, the animals look unhappy, you know, you don't want to look at it, there's a good possibility there's something imbalanced in your ecosystem that you're not doing, right? So in general, we don't want to kind of separate these requirements. Today, I wouldn't say that there's a big driver in aquarium technology as much as we're just in the next generation of what we can do. So the Monterey Bay Aquarium just opened this year, a midnight zone aquarium. This is huge, right? And part of that is because their midnight zone aquarium is meant to be a variety of animals that are actually pretty hard to get to the surface anyways. They're under a lot of pressure. So it took a really long time to figure out how to get them to the top without them exploding. Okay. And then to figure out, having never viewed them for an extended period of time, what they want to eat, what temperature they need to be at, what they like, how much light they can actually deal with. And then because public aquariums are the main space for keeping these animals, how can you make this important to the public when they cannot see it correctly, right? Humans are not meant to look into deep water like that. Like, our eyes don't actually function very well. And so the main driver is this weird mix of like, how do we do all of these things to keep the science moving forward? How do we shift that? Conservation is a big one, but it's still, we're still kind of struggling with how, you know, aquariums are working. So in Australia, they've started asking people to keep coral in their home tanks so that someday, hopefully, it can be transplanted out again, right? So we've created this network of orc tanks. But kind of how will that work in the future? Not sure at the moment. So the technology is moving forward, but for all of the reasons that we've kind of named, right? There's this, people always want bigger aquaria, right? And we've seen the impact of that, by the way, which is aquarium explosions happen occasionally, not just in movies. There are a lot of things that are pushing the field forward. And one of those is that no matter what part of the field you're in, sustainability is the big one, right? So the last chapter of my book is about breeding fish for captivity. Part of that is the science. We want to know how fish breed, right? And the only place we can do that is in an aquarium. Part of that is aesthetics. The home aquarium hobbyist community and the public aquarium community are the largest consumers of ornamental fish. we don't want to have to take them off of reefs anymore. So conservation wise, we want to be able to breed them in captivity. And food, right? Because we want to be able to eat fish more if we could breed them in captivity. And so these types of multi-pronged sustainability issues are big at the moment. Every community has a different reason for doing that, right? Not everyone cares about climate change just because they have an aquarium. Not everyone cares about those things. But the industry is being really driven by sustainability right now.
So just going back for a second to tinkering as a big component of the evolution of aquariums. I wonder if you could tell us about Mary Akers. You've got this wonderful description of this person early in your book, and she seems to exemplify a lot of the components of aquarium technology and how it's developed. Mary Akers, who, as I understand it, is quite the authority on breeding hermit crabs.
Yeah. So there's a lot of different people in my book that show up like this. I really enjoy characters a lot. Mary Akers is a woman who's really important for a couple different reasons. One is that she's not a scientist. She's a woman who sells hermit crab gear on Etsy. She says she's a horrible scientist in college, and so she became a sculptor and an art teacher. And when she retired, she decided to try breeding hermit crabs. And the difficulty of hermit crabs is that you can buy hermit crabs from people, you can get them and things like that, but they have this multi-pronged lifestyle where they go into the water for a while. They have to be born there. And then at some point, they have to emerge from the water, these tiny, naked little hermit crabs, and crawl up onto the shore and grab their first shell, right? And it is not an easy thing to get them to do it and to learn how to, what aquarists call, close the cycle, which is to get a generation of hermit crabs that were born in captivity to then lay eggs and have those hermit crabs become adult and get to a mature phase, right? And so she started keeping a blog and taught other people how to do this. I learned about her because of her blog, but also when I started mentioning her online, one of my friends who has a preschool class said, "Oh yeah, like she's on my hermit crab Facebook group and taught me how to keep my hermit crabs alive," right? So she's really important because in some sense, she is an example of a person that is really integral to the way that we think about the life cycle of an animal. And she has no formal academic training to do it. And she also is very good at spreading that information, right? And it doesn't matter if you're a preschool teacher or you're a scientist. If you're working on hermit crabs, you've heard of Mary Akers, right? That's what you're doing. There's another person in the book named Martin Moe. He's equally as important, right? He worked for the fisheries department in Florida. And then he started working at the fisheries department. He and another friend, Gary Holt, they got really bored doing stuff that were just, it was kind of day to day. And so they decided to try their hand at breeding clownfish. And they both did it independently. Martin Moe was the first person to breed clownfish and close the cycle in captivity. And then his partner was the first to kind of scale up to do it in a kind of commercial way. Both of their ventures went bankrupt. And so they released an enormous amount of information on how to do it. This is why people can buy clownfish wherever they can, why they breed it, because they gave that information. Martin Moe still does things like this. So he was the first to breed the orchid dottyback, and just recently bred and figured out how to close the cycle on black sea urchins. He did this in a bathroom that he converted in his house to his laboratory. And he gave the information on how to breed those sea urchins to the University of Florida, who scaled it up. And now, I mean, sea urchins are really important to the conservation of a reef ecosystem. They eat the algae so that it doesn't overgrow the reef, but the algae is needed to create oxygen on the reef. So that this is the kind of symbiotic relationship that exists between urchins and algae on the reef. If they don't exist, in the 70s, there was a large die-off of black urchins in Jamaica, and it destroyed all the reefs. They all died. So Martin Moe said, I'm going to work on this in my bathroom, right? And he figured it out. He gave to the University of Florida, and now the University of Florida has scaled up the ability to breed these. And now whenever they plant coral, they plant urchin too, right? This is like Martin Moe's going to save the ocean, right, from his bathroom. And that's like amazing. So he's a tinkerer, right? He just sits there for years and years, and he says, what do you want to eat? When you're born, do you want shrimp or do you want, plant? Like, which would you prefer? How big does it have to be? How small does it have to be? Right? Do you like the lights on or off? Like, these are the questions. He, in his book on breeding the orchid dottyback, he says that he celebrates Mother's Day that year because he says, I am the mother. I'm a maternal figure of these fish, right? So these are the people that Mary Akers and Martin Moe, and there's just a billion of these other people in the book. They have these qualities, and one of them is that they don't give up, right? They like to tinker. They're engineers in some sense. They just like to sit there and tinker. But the other one is that they literally recognize how important their work is, in the sense that they never keep their information to themselves. They are not shy about letting other people know how they did it. And that's really important to the spread of aquarium knowledge, right? Which is that they are openly able to communicate what they're doing, and that they don't try to hide it, right? There's no glory in being the parent of a fish if you can't tell anyone.
How much could this kind of science, where there's this interaction between the professionals and the, I don't know, the hobbyists, the enthusiasts, the tinkerers, whatever you want to call them, how transferable is that, do you think, to other areas of science? Is it unique to this scientific culture that you're looking at?
I make the argument that it's extremely unique. And the reason is kind of twofold. One is that it's unique because of the technology. So one thing that we see as historians of science is this kind of development of technology. So you have people, they develop a technology, a discipline or field forms around that technology. So we'll say something like telescopes, right? Or meteorological information, right? And so you get these fields that form around them, and then the technology is standardized, and then it becomes so incredibly standardized. Meteorology, not this, but you might say like you get something like large array telescopes or something that only scientists have access to that information, right? So there's no, you can still have people that are amateurs, but they're not communicating in such a way that they're able to have these kind of academic conversations and make major inroads into academic science. We see this in DNA. We see, there's laboratory equipment. You can't afford to order it, right? And even if you could, it would have to be incredibly standardized and whatnot. Aquarium technology is not like this, right? When you see people writing dissertations that require aquariums, one of my favorite things is to check to see where they got them. And I read this whole dissertation on fish breeding from the University of Hawaii, and in this very tiny footnote, he says like he found the aquarium technology on the side of the road, right? I mean, like, it can't be standardized, and you have to spend time with it tinkering. It doesn't matter if you're a laboratory like Valerie Paul's laboratory in Florida that's working on, coral disease, or if you're a public aquarium, or if you're like a hobbyist at home. You're still going to start with a fairly simplistic system, and then you have to just tinker until you get it right for where you are and what you're doing. And that makes it very specific to marine science. And it also means that level of communication has to always be open, because someone can be really, really good at tank work, right? And not even know what they're doing. So if you're a hobbyist and you're just messing around at home, if someone goes onto Reddit and says, hey, I got these fish, I'm using them for an experiment and they're acting this really weird way, someone is going to come back in and say, oh yeah, you know what? Your like pH is too low, right? That's why they act like that. And it really, if you don't have that, you're just going to lose your whole experiment. So, it is very specific to marine science, and it's very specific, and it's because of the technology, because it cannot be standardized at all.
I wish it could be more of a model for other realms of science, just because it seems more democratic and more fluid, less hierarchical and formal and academic in the worst sense of the word. But anyway, I'm glad to know it's happening here. I just wanted to get into a kind of philosophical question that you raise in your book. So aquariums are like a little microcosm of the ocean. And, some are absurdly simple, like just a bowl with a goldfish, and some are very elaborate, the big fancy aquariums that people pay money to see, that are very elaborately constructed and have a lot of fish swimming around. But it's artificial, it's supposed to represent the ocean, but of course it doesn't, it can't. And you talk in your book about how this raises the question of what is real, at what point a simulation might replace the reality. This is a question that what's his name, Baudrillard, the French philosopher, talked about in his famous book, Simulation and Simulacra. Yeah. So I wonder if you could, and it becomes really poignant at the end of your book, because you say at some point these artificial systems might replace the reality, which is, it's good that we can do that, but it's also awful if you think that there might not be any real wilderness left represented by the oceans. So I'm just laying this out here for you to riff on.
Yeah, it's interesting. So in the book, I try really hard not to make this a sad story, right? So, and I don't necessarily think it is. I'm not making a normative claim, like we should save the ocean so that we don't have to swim in aquariums for the rest of our lives. It's very interesting. People who work on the marine realm are experiencing climate shifts faster than people who work in the terrestrial realm. And so there's a lot of work on this, but the ocean is warming a lot faster than land, right? And so people who work in this area, it's kind of a foregone conclusion that we're going to lose a lot of the ocean, right, as we know it. And so maybe I'm a bit flippant about it because I work with these people and I see their kind of conversation, and I see that they're not giving up. They're just like, listen, we're going to fight through it any way that we possibly can. So, hobbyists say that you save what you know. This is a thing that they start every meeting with, and they end every meeting with, like, you save what you know, you love what you know, right? And so there's a point in which it's important to understand how valuable aquariums are, right? How valuable they are to the way that humans value the ocean, how valuable they are to the way that we view the ocean, and then as a tool, how valuable they are to the way that we save the ocean, right? There will come a point, like right now, in the time that I wrote this book, so I've been writing this book for about a decade. When I started it, no one in the public sphere was really talking about coral farming. And I would say in the last 2 years, it has become a major form of public conversation about conservation in the ocean, which is that we are going to have to assist evolution to build coral that are heat resistant, that are bleaching resistant. We're going to have to raise those coral in captivity, and we're going to have to plant them and garden them, right? It's going to be a requirement if we want to have reefs, right, in the future. And this is, it's just what will happen. So when we look at aquarium craft and we look at tank craft and the people who are doing this, these are the people that are going to construct the future ocean for us, right? They're people who are working in their, basement or their extra bathroom. And that's not a bad thing, right? It's actually a really great thing. Would I love it if we could reverse climate change enough to save some of these things without having to intervene? Totally. But historians and sociologists of science also are very uncomfortable with using terms like wilderness, right? Because, you know, if you go to the bottom of Marianas Trench, there's plastic there. There's no untouched ocean. And the only untouched ocean that I can think of is stuff that we just haven't seen, right? Which is most of it. And it doesn't mean we haven't touched it. We just haven't seen our footprint yet. So in the book, I make it pretty clear that there is something very important about understanding tank craft. And the importance is, well, there is, like you call it, democratic science. There is open communication between these groups, and it is really important. We still have this fixation when it comes to the public of saying, okay, well, what are we going to do about this, right? And when we call on experts, we still have an obsession with calling on academic experts, right? And what I want to say is, when it comes down to it, if you want to get something done in the ocean, you better make sure that you have groups of public aquarists, academic experts, and home hobbyist group people together. You cannot just have academics and save the ocean. You just can't do it. And it's going to bear out, but it's important that it bears out in such a way that we don't waste an enormous amount of time and resources thinking that the academy is going to fix something that they're actually pretty late to the game about, all things considered, right?
Yeah. I mean, I guess the more people who care about these sorts of things, the better. So I'm wondering if you could, I mean, I'm always looking for ways to be optimistic and to communicate that to my students, many of whom are very frightened when they look into the future. They're frightened by climate change and by lots of other things. So is there any particular project that's going on right now involving, let's say, coral reefs, that makes you feel good when you think about it?
I mean, like I said, you know, people who work on the ocean have a tendency to be pretty optimistic for people who are watching it deteriorate, right? And it's actually really funny because I teach environmental history a lot, and students will come up to me and they'll say, like, you know, how do you deal with this? Like, it is like a pressure on my chest. And I say, you know, maybe it's just the group of people that I work with, that there is an enormous amount of optimism in this community. They're always doing something, trying to figure something out. I'm not going to say there's something that I absolutely love or hate. I think everyone's doing fantastic stuff, right? If you read my last chapter of my book, you know, there's this consortium of people that are working on ornamental fish breeding. When I started this project, it was like there was maybe, you know, 5 fish that were being consistently bred in captivity, and we've gone up to about 40 now, right? And part of that is this really beautiful system where SeaWorld and a couple other major public aquariums give their eggs to the University of Florida. Their tropical system learns how to raise those eggs and close the cycle in captivity. And then they pass that knowledge on to commercial breeders in Florida. Those breeders then, you know, scale up the system, and then they can sell those fish back to those public aquariums at a huge markup, right? So these public aquariums are funding, like basically funding an industry of people who are producing knowledge and couldn't do it otherwise at a loss. SeaWorld takes a huge loss here. They fund all of this research, it's huge. And the University of Florida gives all this information away, right? Because they are a land grant school. When they figure out how to do something, like when I called them to interview, they said, come on over, we'll just show you our tanks. I could have learned to breed fish in a day, right? Because that's the way they do that. So things like that, I think, are valuable when we think about what are people doing. There's this kind of growth that's happening, and it looks quiet from the surface, but if you kind of look further, you can see that people are really thoughtful about the way that they're doing that, because that doesn't just have to do with conservation. It's this kind of connection of people that makes it easier to just make conservation happen, right? We have a lot of conversation about saving fish or saving reefs, but poor people in Florida will ruin a reef faster than if you give them jobs, right? And they don't have to be conservationists to do that, but they're much less likely to, do negative things toward the environment if they are living a quality lifestyle, right? So this community is doing a really good job of keeping their eye both on the ocean and on the way that people need to be invested in that, right? And these communities are doing that all over the world, not just in Florida, but in like Fiji. They're raising huge giant clams, and in South America, and all of these amazing spaces. So I think those are the places that make me really happy, because we've seen a lot of anger and frustration in the environmental community because regular people just don't care. We've seen a lot of frustration on the other side because environmentalists are just out of touch. And because this is such a democratic community, I feel like it has naturally kind of grown and mushroomed in a way that incorporates those communities, and we don't see quite so much infighting in those groups. And so that's what really makes me optimistic, is that there's this focus on humans and the ocean. In general, though, I think just being around people who love the ocean is a really great way to enhance your optimism, right? If everyone's just always doom and gloom, you don't get very far. One of my advisors at the Smithsonian, where I was lucky enough to do this work and have a postdoc there, started a hashtag called Ocean Optimism, where people just go in and they drop, this is what we figured out, this is what we're doing, etc. And those are like places where these people are doing fantastic work. So if you want to be optimistic, I'm the lady to come to, because I find all of this optimistic, right?
Well, I definitely always feel better after interaction with you, like this one today. So that's great. Thank you. I really appreciate that answer. If I feel like I'm not cheering up my students enough, I'll just drag you out of your office and bring you down to my class and
send them on over to me. Sometimes I'm happy in sadness, right? I mean, sometimes it's okay to wallow. And I think that is also a part of, getting through environmental and conservation fatigue, which we all have, right? Everything can't be happy all the time. So, students, I think, or just people in general, you just get a lot of fatigue. I got another thing to feel bad about today. Oh my God, the ocean. And so it is really funny, because when I wrote the book, I think the first question I often get asked is, do I think this is a bad thing? Do I think artificial oceans are a bad thing? And that's why I hate to say something like that. No, I don't. I think that they're just a thing. And I think, we can do what we can to make them less important, but it doesn't mean that they aren't the future, and that we shouldn't kind of place our interest and our optimism in that, in some sense.
Well, okay, so here's the book again. I'm holding it up correctly this time, so people can see it. So the same enthusiasm and uplifting way of looking at things that you've just given us here, this book is loaded with it, and as well as just like all this really fascinating information about the oceans and aquariums and the people who work on them. So thank you very much